So, Jessica, I mean, for folks that don't have a sense about the state of Delaware, give us a sense of it. I mean, I know you live in Wilmington, and that is distinct in many respects from Delaware as well. But give us a sense about who you have to appeal to in this state if you are going to defeat Chris Coons in this primary.
Sure. So I'm sure people know it's a pretty small state. We have fewer than 1 million people here, but in a lot of ways, it's a state that's in some ways a microcosm of the country. We have dense city populations, we have rural and farms, we have suburbs, and we have the beaches. So we have a really diverse state as far as the types of communities that we have here. But it's also a state where we have really drastic wealth inequality. We have really poor, under-resourced neighborhoods that are just 2 miles away from historically very wealthy neighborhoods that have been around since the DuPonts first kind of put their stake here in Delaware. So what we're looking at is who are the people who have been Bernie voters in 2016, Carrie Evelyn Harris voters in 2018, who have become the base of the progressive push here in our state? And who are the people who are feeling really disenfranchised or disengaged based on the choices that they've been presented for years now? That there really has been limited choice in Delaware. It's not a state that has a lot of primaries to incumbents. It's very uncommon, and it takes a lot of courage for someone like Carrie Evelyn Harris last year to do that, and for the many candidates that are doing that this year. So we want to look at those voters too, those people who haven't felt like voting makes a difference because their life doesn't materially change no matter who's in that seat. So that's where we are focusing our strategy, is getting out voters who are younger, who are less engaged, and who are already bought into this progressive agenda that we're putting forward.
So when we're talking about a state this size, I mean, I'm in a city with more people probably within a 5 or 10 mile radius. How I guess what is its history in terms of electing Republicans? In other words, I know it's a D6 state, if I'm not mistaken, which is basically the Democrats have a 6-point advantage on day one, if you will, relative to any generic Republican. But I mean, how great? I mean, what are the implications of winning the primary, I guess, is what I want to say, in terms of the general election for the Senate there?
I think the prospects are good. I don't think that we would be jeopardizing a Democratic seat. As you mentioned, it is a blue state here. Our voter registration skews Democratic drastically. The state has had largely Democratic representation for decades now. So I don't think that we're not necessarily presenting a concern about disrupting the ability to have a Democrat representing us in the Senate.
Okay, and I asked that because, obviously that's a big question that people have in terms of primaries. How much are we jeopardizing this seat? Obviously, every seat in the Senate is really important. Now, with that said, I would be less than forthcoming if I didn't say that I was very much hoping that somebody would primary Chris Coons for a myriad of reasons. And I want to get, obviously, to the list of issues that you support in a bit, because I think there, obviously people should have positive reasons to vote. But when we're talking about voting for a challenger against incumbent, I think there has to be a case as to why the incumbent is not necessarily serving their constituency well. And now I have about a half dozen reasons of my own about Chris Coons, and we've been mostly talking to challengers of Congress people, and I generally don't have this many reasons. But let's hear yours. I mean, specifically in terms of Chris Coons, where is Chris Coons failing the people of Delaware?
Yeah, so at the core point here, there are quite a few contrasts that I'm drawing, right? I am looking to run a campaign that is people-centric. I want a government that puts our people at its core and legislates for the people. And we have a senator right now who is not focused on that. He has taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from industries like Big Pharma, and that then directly starts working on bills that are going to benefit those industries. So he's working on a bill right now to do quote unquote patent reform. But what that is doing is actually putting stronger patents in the hands of pharmaceutical companies, preventing generic competition and creating higher prices for Delawareans. So when I look at things like that, I see a senator who's not fighting for the people of Delaware. I look at things like lack of commitment to economic justice. Things like saying minimum wage, raising it to $15, that it wouldn't necessarily be, it would be too much money for places in even our state. And we know that that's not true. We know that to have a median run-of-the-mill sort of average one-bedroom apartment, you need to be making at least $18 in our state to be able to afford that without overtaxing yourself. So he's not even clued into the experience that voters have in our state. And on top of that, he really seems to have bipartisanship in his mind as the end game. And I don't inherently have a problem with bipartisanship or compromise, but when I see that done at the expense of Delawareans, that's when I start to recognize that there has to be something beyond bipartisanship that we are fighting for. It can't be simply about making that compromise. The example of this is last year when he worked with Jeff Flake during the Kavanaugh hearings to fight for this FBI investigation. And then he and Jeff Flake went on this tour on television talking about this compromise while the FBI completely failed to conduct a thorough investigation of the claims that were against Brett Kavanaugh. And those are the things that Chris Coons has been doing, like rubber stamping a lot of Trump judges. He's voted for more than 80 of them, many of which who are anti-choice and anti-women's rights and civil rights and have not confirmed their support for things like Brown versus Board of Education. He has confirmed many of Trump's appointees, including people like Kirstjen Nielsen, who is no longer in the job after she was defending the camps that exist at our borders right now. People like Alex Azar, who is a drug company lobbyist and former drug company executive who is now running Health and Human Services. And he wants to position himself as a centrist that can make deals, but in reality, it ends up just pulling him to the right side and not fighting for the people of Delaware.
You know, I know that Politico magazine called him the quote, the GOP's favorite Democrat. And I'm glad you brought up that notion of a supposed bipartisanship. Very often, in my experience, and I've been watching this stuff for 15 years, that is often a fig leaf to promote, like you say, a corporate agenda. When Chris Coons is already talking about, after Mitch McConnell has basically just turned the Senate into a factory to confirm right-wing judges. They have confirmed more judges almost in 3 years under Trump than they did under 8 years under Obama on the circuit court. When Chris Coons says he wants to bring back the filibuster if the Democrats take control, that to me is a sign that this guy does not want Democrats to be able to influence our government in the way that Republicans have. And I understand if you come from Montana or something and this is your disposition, but this is a state that is, like we said earlier, a Democratic leaning state by over 6 points. We talked about what the nature of Delaware and, frankly, the shortcomings of Chris Coons, who is a U.S. senator. And this is why I think, you know, to a large extent, it is important for a national audience to hear from you because Chris Coons obviously is a senator, but he's one of those people who's talking about, let's bring back the filibuster if the Democrats attain power. In other words, let's give the Republicans the right to inhibit our ability to in some way mitigate the damage that has been done by the Republicans to our judiciary over the past 10 years because of their obstruction under Obama. This is also a guy, and I do want to get to your issue set because it's a great one as far as I'm concerned. This is always a guy who is also on record as saying that he thinks some of the partisan rancor is a function of, frankly, having a diverse set of senators. I don't know if you caught that. I imagine you have. How important it is to you? Obviously, you're running as a person who supports things like universal health care and housing as a right and combating climate change and economic justice. But I mean, tell me your thoughts about the question of diversity. Do you think that's the problem as to why there's such polarization in our politics?
I think that it is not necessarily diversity that is causing polarization. I think it is a top versus bottom struggle. And people on the bottom are recognizing that they don't feel supported by their government, and that's what they want to see. I think that when you look at the current Senate, you certainly don't see it representing the people of America. And that is something that I think needs to change, because that is why it's not representing the right type of legislation or working in a way to help the people of America. Delaware is a state that has actually never had a female senator. It's never had an African-American senator or Hispanic senator. We have only had men in that seat for both of those seats for the history of our state. So
Wow.
That doesn't look like our state. So that I do think is something that, while important, it is not the only thing that I am obviously running on. But I think it's important to call out that, yeah, we've tried these same types of people with the same types of experience, and this is where we've gotten. So if we want different results, we need different people. We need different types of experience.
So let's talk about the issues you support. What sits atop your agenda as a senator from Delaware?
Well, I want to talk one bit about Chris Coons on that before I get there, because I am putting forth a pretty progressive platform, and I will talk about it. And he is someone who has called these plans, literally used the words wild-eyed and referred to them as irrational. He is actively working against progressive initiatives right now in the Senate. I assume because he's expecting to see a President Sanders or a President Warren. And he is working with the Budget Committee to pass budget austerity rules that would automatically trigger austerity based on government spending. And that is something that is going to inhibit our ability to put forth the progressive agenda that we want to see. So this is someone who's teaming up with Republicans, again, celebrating their bipartisanship and celebrating coming to an agreement, but at the cost to who? At the cost to people like us who need better services and better programs from our government. And some of those better services and programs that I want to see there's 5 core pieces that I'm running on. One, universal health care. That's Medicare for all, completely comprehensive, no premiums, no deductibles, no copays. You go to the doctor for medical, dental, vision, mental health care, and you leave free at the point of service. We need to lower the price of prescription drugs. We need to be able to negotiate with the drug companies. We need to find ways to break the monopolies that these drug companies have to lower prices and provide patients with more options. I want the federal government to be focused on equitable education. I think our federal government's lack of priority of education and funding behind education has put our states in a position where they are hamstrung and they're unable to create equal systems, because the only tool that they really have at their disposal are property taxes, which are inherently unequal. So the government needs to be committed to free public education from childcare and pre-K all the way through higher education, trade school, 2-year college, 4-year college, whatever that might be for that student. We know that a high school education is not setting people up for success anymore. We need to make sure that we are progressing our education system with where our workforce is going as well. We need to cancel student debt, which is completely hamstrung an entire generation. And we need to make sure that our schools have funding for the wraparound services that actually make them core strengths, strong points in a neighborhood. So that's things like free meals so that hunger isn't a barrier to education, classroom supplies, nurses, counselors, social workers. These are things that we know schools are lacking, but they make a difference in a child's education. I also believe housing is a right. As I mentioned earlier, it's expensive to live in Delaware. It's not New York or San Francisco, it's Seattle. It's not hitting the headlines, but it's expensive to live here. And all we are seeing right now is development in that luxury tier that only very wealthy people can afford. So we need a federal investment in housing programs so that we can eradicate homelessness in this country. We are the richest country in the world. No one should be going without a safe and affordable home. It is integral to living in this country and surviving in this country. I'm batting climate change. I would sign on to the Green New Deal, transform our energy system, and the extraction of fossil fuels. I'm sorry, finally, just economic justice. I recognize that this is a top versus bottom fight here. We need to make sure that our government is representing working people and fighting to make sure that no one is struggling in our country. No one here should be too poor to live.
So, Jessica, walk us through, just a little bit about you. We have about 2 minutes left here, but just tell us a little bit about yourself. What qualifies you? I mean, aside from having a platform that I think a lot of people support, and your opponent not supporting any, if much of it, what qualifies you to run, and what do you need to do to beat a guy like Chris Coons in the primary?
Yeah. So my drive here is seeing in my work as a board president of a nonprofit here, is that I had to go up against our government to ensure that our state government didn't cut nonprofit funding when it had a budget gap. And that was really eye-opening to me, that even when we have these services, which we only have because the government fails to provide them, but even when we have them, we know they're not guaranteed. And that is what has exposed me to a different type of experience than we have seen in senators. And I think the qualification should be, do you understand how people live? Do you understand the problems that people are facing in our country? And can you put forth ideas and programs that are going to make it better for people and change their outlook and standard of living in life? As far as what I think it's going to take for us to win, there was a poll released just today by Data for Progress that shows Coons is trailing a generic, more liberal candidate. And when people get exposed to his record, that gap grows even further. So that's our strategy. It is get out on as many doors. We are planning to knock more doors than has ever been knocked in the state. Just last week, we had 20 people out in December in 40-degree weather, which is a lot of people for Delaware, especially this early. And we are going to make sure that we are on the doors, hearing from people, bringing their ideas into our policies, and bringing that vision forward. So not only are we saying, here's what's actually happening with your representative in Washington right now, and here's how we believe it can be different.
When is the primary?
It is September 15th, 2020.
September 15th, 2020. So you got about 10 months to get volunteers, donations. Yep. Folks can head to your website. Why don't you give it that to us now?
Sure. It's justfordelaware.com. If they head to justfordelaware.com/donate, they can make donations. Obviously, that's really important for us coming up on the filing deadline. We are only 3 weeks into this campaign, so we haven't had a lot of this quarter. So we are really looking to push towards the end of the year to show people that there's support and power behind this campaign.
Jessica Scarane, I wish you all the luck in the world, and I'm so glad that Chris Coons is getting a primary race this year. And again, good luck.